Welcome to the podcast of top executive coach Tony Mayo. This podcast is a recording of one of Tony's teleseminars. You can join future teleseminars at no charge by registering at tiny.cc/mayocall. That URL is tiny.cc/mayocall.
Well, the topic I had in mind for today is integrity, and integrity used with a particular meaning, a particular way.
One of my favorite words.
Good. Well, let's see if we can use it in a similar way that's useful for all of us. I'd like to introduce this topic by bringing up a story that seems like an urban legend of the rock band that shows up for a concert. And when they notice that there are some brown M&Ms in the bowl of candy, they refuse to perform. Have you heard that one?
Yeah. No.
And when you hear a story like that about the performer who's refuses to go on stage after seeing something like that seems so trivial, I mean, what thoughts do you have about the people that make that decision?
Well, when I first heard the story, I thought these guys are just, ridiculously spoiled, and I was quite surprised when I heard why they actually did it.
Yeah,
so
it turns
out. Let me get clear. They walk into a place.
Yeah, they show up for a concert. They had stipulated certain things that they wanted in the dressing room, and among them was a bowl of M&Ms with no brown M&Ms. And when they walk in and see that there are M&Ms with brown ones in there, they refuse to perform. And this story gets passed around, and usually in the form that Rohit mentioned, that they're prima donnas, they're looking for excuses to go off and exercise their power. But it turns out this...
But if that's the word that the people contract them, if they give the word that they will have the M&Ms, they violated the contract by not fulfilling on the promise. Right,
and that's why I use this as an integrity story. It turns out this is true. It's from Van Halen, and David Lee Roth in his autobiography talks about it. And he says the reason this occurred is because they were one of the first bands to go in what they called tertiary markets. They didn't just play the big stadiums or the other professional halls. They would go into smaller places like high school football stadiums or parks and that kind of thing. But they were a big show. They would show up with 17 or 18 semi-trailers full of equipment. And they found they had to have a lot of preparation to put this show on, that they had to have a certain amount of electrical power available. They had to have a stage that would support a certain amount of weight because of their equipment and so on. So they would write these huge contracts with all the requirements for the show to go on successfully and safely, to the point where one of the reasons they did this is they once had the stage buckle during a performance. Pretty dangerous thing to have happen. But they were concerned that promoters would get this thick phone book of a contract and not read it. So they created a sort of canary in the coal mine by burying in the midst of this a requirement that there be a bowl of M&Ms with no brown M&Ms. That way, as soon as they walk in the dressing room before the show, they look. If there are brown M&Ms, they know the contract was not read. They have to check everything. So rather than looking for an excuse not to perform, what they're doing is trying to find a way to be reliable, to actually put on the show that they intend to put on. And this gets to the concept of integrity. The way I use the word is about having things work. It's used often today as having moral weight or ethical value, sort of a substitute for being a good person to say they have integrity. But for my purposes, I'm talking about what works, what doesn't. And having all the pieces perform as expected, that to me, that means integrity, from the engineering sense of integrity, when all the parts are there and they mesh properly. Things integrate well together. It makes it work. So far, so good?
Yeah, a lot of people mistakenly think of integrity as morality. Integrity have nothing to do with morality. And I always tell people that the mafia operate with very high integrity because they do what they say they were going to do. If you owe them $10,000 and they say they're coming tonight for the money, and if you don't have it, they're going to break your knees, be ready to be in a wheelchair if you don't have the money, because they will break your knees. So they make a promise and they will fulfill the promise. Now, is that has ethics? No, it has no ethics, but it has integrity.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about keeping your word. These guys, they keep their word. Don't mess with the mafia, man.
So I'm using integrity as what works.
The politicians promise everything and they produce nothing.
Yeah, there you go. That's why people are so frustrated with politics and why we hear about Washington being broken or the system doesn't work, because the integrity has gone out of it. You may have heard about it recently here. A housing cluster elected as president of its board a dog. Yes, apparently the same person kept getting the job as president. He was tired of doing the job. He had a sense no one was paying attention. So he put his dog on the ballot, and the dog was elected president of the association, and he's going to continue doing the work. But I thought, well, the dog's probably a natural politician. His only skill is shaking hands and being friendly.
And not cleaning up after his own poop.
Yeah, so distinguishing integrity, first of all, from these other areas is useful. So integrity is about consistency, having things perform the way they're expected. It's about performance and what works. Whereas morals is about what's right, what's virtuous. Of course, I'm sure the two of you recognize that it's a historical discourse. That's a conversation that was going on before you arrived, before I was born, and there were a set of values of what was right and what was wrong, and we were born into a pre-existing set of those, and we may have seen them modify over time. We may have even influenced modifying them. But morals are distinct from integrity. Ethics, properly used, is the standards for being included in a group. So you talk about professional ethics. There are a set of standards that we have to agree to adhere to, or you're going to be excluded from the group. Doesn't necessarily, again, have moral value, but it's just a set of agreed rules. It's another conversation where people set up these functions where they say, if you do this, you're in. If you do that, you're out. Again, not necessarily about integrity. And then there's the whole legal domain. And what distinguishes the legal domain is that the legal rules are enforceable by violence. So we've given government entities permission to incarcerate people, restrict their freedoms if they violate those laws. So we have different kinds of laws. Another thing that's interesting to note about these different sets of rules is that integrity just works. And I can give you some evidence for that later on. Morals, ethics, and legal systems are only effective with integrity. So I don't need morals, ethics, or laws for integrity to be useful, but I do need integrity for the other things to be useful. I think that makes integrity a more fundamental concept, a more fundamental practice for people to use. Any comments on that so far?
I have this knee-jerk reaction. I'm not finding a counterexample yet, but I gotta believe, or at least I'm drawn to believe, that it's useful to have a law that says I can't kill somebody without there being any integrity among the people over whom I impose that law.
But if that law is not enforced with integrity, you run into some serious problems. So you might be in the medieval era when nobles could kill non-nobles with impunity, yet their murder was a crime. That just wasn't, enforced.
How about the 1940s in Alabama?
Yeah, how about that? We don't have to go as far away as I did to get examples of that. And then people start not to respect the institutions and the rules, and things start to break down. And we see that going on in the Middle East now. For a certain period of time, everybody agreed that Mubarak functioned as leader of the country. And as long as enough people agreed that was his role, things he said and did had the force of law. As soon as enough people said, we're not going to treat him like president anymore. He wasn't. He couldn't. I mean, it wasn't because of the strength of his arms or his intellect that he was president. It was because enough people agreed that he would be He would be the president.
So then, okay, well, that was a clean case. But then what do you say about Gaddafi? There are a lot of people in agreement that he's not president.
Right now he's got a good number that agree that or see it is in their interest to let him function as president, who are taking orders from him. But as soon as if a few more of those decide that they don't want to respect him as president, it's over. Yeah, I don't have any formula of how many or which people have to change their opinion. But the important thing is it's a matter of getting other people to act as though you have a certain status. Then you have that status.
Right, but going back to this law integrity thing, so it sounds like there's a certain number of people who can act with no integrity, and the law will be useful and be maintained. And when the number of people acting without integrity gets large enough, then the law can't work anymore. So had there been, for example, 9 black people in Alabama, they still wouldn't have any civil rights.
Which 9 are you referring to?
I said if there had been just 9 black people in Alabama,
oh, right,
they still wouldn't have any civil rights. It required a certain number of people not being acted with integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It required a certain number of people to be on whatever that square is called in Cairo.
Right.
It required a certain mass of people for whom the integrity left for the laws not to hold. So you can have this mush of laws being useful and integrity being found only in, I don't know, a plurality of places, a majority of places, I don't know.
Yeah, and I want to give credit for the way I'm using the word integrity here. I'm drawing heavily on a paper that was written by Werner Erhard, the founder of EST, and Michael Jensen, who's a professor at the Harvard Business School and an economist. They published this article in a very interesting way. It's published on the social science research database, which is part of this trend of publishing academic articles free on the internet instead of in expensive journals. And this was actually started by Jensen because he was a proponent of that sort of thing. But they published it iteratively. They would put up a draft and ask for comments, and then they put up another draft a few months later and ask for comments. So it's been growing over the last few years. It's a very interesting way to improve something. And they've been spending a lot of time making presentations on this to bar associations and business schools and that sort of thing. Now, so their definition of integrity is in 2 parts. Yep. Oh, I've adjusted my microphone. Is that helpful?
There you go. There you are. There you are. There you
Okay.
are. There you are. That's great.
Thanks for letting me know that. So here's the definition of integrity that they use and I have found useful. Part 1 is, say again?
Who uses that? You say they use?
Yes. Much of what I'm saying today is based on an article published by Werner Erhard and Michael Jensen.
Oh, yeah. Is it that from the Harvard?
Yes. Yeah, Jensen's from Harvard Business School, and Erhard is best known for EST and landmark education. And that is to do what you say. So have integrity, have the pieces fit together between what you say and what you do. Now that seems pretty simple and straightforward. It's something that most of us want from each other. But there's a limitation if you stop right there. Can you see what the problem is if your whole goal is to act consistently with what you say?
I see 2 problems. One is I might not say very much, and the other is that I might say that I want to do that I'll do something, and then the facts on the ground change, and I'm committed to doing something that I don't think I ought to be doing anymore.
Right. And why might you not say very much?
I don't want to be committed to doing those things.
Yeah, there you go. So that's the problem. I ran into this very distinctly a few years ago when I was running a company. Two of my direct reports were a Naval Reserve captain and a recently retired colonel from the U.S. Marines. I called them into my office one day, talked about how their plans, the things that they were committing themselves to, were not adequate to achieve the company's goals. And they both got very proud on me and said, hey, we are men of honor. We never make a promise we can't keep. I said, well, that's a nice thought. The problem is, I have promised the investors we're going to make money for them. And I don't know exactly how to keep that promise. There's a risk. You've got to make promises bigger than what you're absolutely guaranteed to be able to personally deliver, where you're going to end up, like Rohit said, making little tiny weeny promises. So there has to be a way to swing out, to try big ambitious things, to talk to people about something you want to achieve that's big and still be in integrity. So the second part of the definition is, as soon as you know you can't do what you said, communicate with everyone involved and take responsibility for the consequences. So I can make promises, and if it's something fairly trivial, like being late for an appointment, I get on the phone. I call the person. I tell them something has happened. I'm going to be late for that appointment. Does it still work for you to start 10 minutes late? If it doesn't, I will do my best to find a time that does work for you. If it has cost you something, if it has damaged you in some way, I'm going to try to make up for that. I'm not going to do, which is much more common, is just to pretend it's not a problem. Just to slide over it. In the case of this company, the company did not work out. Investors lost all of their money. And there was one investor, the major investor, who was Sicilian, and maybe that tells you everything you need to know about his personality. He had a reputation as a hothead and being vindictive. I got in my car, drove to his office, explained to him that as far as we could tell, the company was not going to work out, and we were going to lose all the money. He listened to me as I described what we tried for a few minutes, and he said, well, I can tell that you've done everything you could to make this work. I knew it was a risk when I went in. Thank you for coming out here and telling me. See, that was putting in the second part of integrity. I couldn't deliver the return on investment that I had said I intended to do, that I'd put in a business plan, in writing. But I was willing to go there and, take my licks, to be honest about what was possible, what I expected, so that as soon as I knew, he could take appropriate steps with this new knowledge. And then I get to stay in integrity. And you can see that's also workable. It's all about communicating. I was talking to one client about this concept, and she noticed that it's all about communicating. If I intend to make something happen, I communicate it. I say what I'm going to do. If I can't do it, or if I'm going to do something different or at a different time, I communicate again. And that gives people a chance to participate, to have some impact on the outcome, instead of just drawing in. That's another common reaction when things aren't going the way we had expected them to sort of bear down and get private and force it through yourself. That's pretty unpleasant, and in many situations isn't going to work out as well as getting other people involved by going to them and saying, hey, this may not work out. I want you to know that, and I want to work with you to come up with the next best alternative. How's that sound?
I'm just wondering, do you have any examples? I mean, this investor was obviously in many ways disarmed by your integrity. But I'm wondering, have you ever had the opposite happen?
I'm trying to think of that. I mean, certainly people get angry. People have emotional reactions when you can't do what you said you had hoped to do. And I'm sure I do that on the other side as well. But if the person will stick with me and make it clear they're willing to engage in what's next, I mean, that's the next best thing. And one thing I encourage my clients is, someone has said they'd have a particular piece of work done on a particular date. You go to them on that date and say, where's the work? They say, I haven't got it. What's the first thing, sort of the knee-jerk response you have when the employee says, I haven't got it done?
I mean, it depends what I need it for. I mean, it would either be, when will you have it done, or why don't you have it done?
Yeah, it's the why not is the sort of knee-jerk. But of course, once you're asking why not, then the two of you are having a conversation about the past, and how much power do you have over the past? Zero. Your other question is much more useful. It's, when can you have it done? And then, what are you going to do differently that can have me be more reliant on what you're saying now? Don't just be sorry. Tell me how you're going to change your method, your approach, who's involved, so there's greater reliability in what you say. Something I say to my kids is, after years and years of training, I've taught them to apologize, which is progress, but it's not the whole trip. I say, I don't want you to be sorry. I want you to be successful. Tell me what you're going to do now. Let's talk about the future where we have some power. We can create some things. So it's that communication about what's next that makes things work. And that's my interest in integrity. It makes things work. Now, on big things like losing large amounts of investors' money or not having a work project done, it's sort of obvious, I think, that doing what you say is effective and makes things work. But small things go a long way too. I was reading a book by the Dr. Atul Gawande. He writes quite a bit on making medicine effective. He's got a book called Better, because it occurred to him that in medicine, what you do has a very serious impact on people's lives. So getting more effective should have a very high return. So he started talking to lots of people who were effectively delivering medical care to see what made them better. His overall conclusion, by the way, he'd expected to find uneven application of technology or resources, that there was some tangible reason for this. But his conclusion was it wasn't the resources, it was the consistency of doing what you know works. In my words, it's high integrity is high level of healthcare. This first came home to him when he was looking at doctors in India, where they had basically no resources, but yet they were having some very positive outcomes because they were doing the things they could do very reliably with a high level of integrity. There's a disease, cystic fibrosis.
Can I
go ahead.
You?
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with this, but this seems like an interesting exploration. He put into the public domain of knowledge the checklist.
Yeah, that was his book after this one.
Right, and so the stuff was already going on, I think in a Michigan hospital or something. Somebody was already doing a study about the 7 things, I think it was, that should be done in an emergency room. Not an emergency, in an intensive care unit. And if they would just check these really basic things, like draping the patient and washing your hands, and equally mundane things that were, from my reading of it, were almost offensive to the doctors who had to check that they were doing such things. It turned out that they had fantastic results in preventing infections and preventing, I don't remember, all sorts of stuff. It was just an incredibly great result. 7 stupid things. Sometime after he wrote that article in the New Yorker, within months, there was an op-ed in the New York Times from the guy in Michigan who was doing this, and the whole program had been shut down.
Right.
Because of doctors basically not wanting to play, finding it offensive, and yet it worked. And this just so it strikes me as this is a huge collapse of integrity.
It is, and that's part of my point that I'm building to here. Is it's not the big breaches of integrity that almost everyone recognizes as a problem. It's the little ones that add up to such big problems. It's not washing their hands. It's not doing those 7 seemingly obvious things in the intensive care unit. An example he gave in better was cystic fibrosis. This is a disease where mucus builds up in the lungs and it becomes very hard to breathe. It's a congenital disease. There's no cure. There are some fairly effective treatments. And the treatments haven't really gotten technologically better in years and years. Yet some clinics have much better outcomes than other. By better outcomes, I mean patients staying out of the hospital for years instead of months. Life expectancy extended by decades. So he went to the clinic with the best health, the best outcomes in cystic fibrosis to watch what they did. And one thing that came home to him is he was there when a high school-aged girl with cystic fibrosis came to see her doctor. And the doctor said, "Have you been taking your medication?" And she says, "Mostly." The doctor says, "Here's what we have. Let's look at the numbers." And the girl rolls her eyes because she's been through this before. There's a blackboard in the examining room. This is part of their treatment, is going to the blackboard, explaining things to them. Let's look at the numbers. A person's daily risk of getting a bad lung illness and going to the hospital is 0.5% a day. The daily risk of getting a bad lung illness with cystic fibrosis plus treatment is 0.05%. So untreated, 0.5%, treated, 0.05%. And that doesn't seem like a lot, because basically, when you experiment, as this girl is doing, you're looking at the difference between a 99.5% chance of being healthy and a 99.95% chance of staying well. On a given day, you basically have a 100% chance of being okay. But he paused. It is a big difference. If you add this risk up over a year, it's a difference between an 83% chance of staying out of the hospital for a year or only a 16% chance of staying out of the hospital. These little things add up, but we're so prone to let the integrity go a little bit at a time. I've got a blog post called "Integrity Ebbs by Inches." I wrote it after I heard a talk by the primary whistleblower at MCI WorldCom, which I think until Mayo-The had the record for the largest financial fraud in world history. She was an internal auditor, started noticing things and looking into things, and was able eventually to put together the picture. And the picture was what I'd sort of suspected on these things. Most of the people involved, maybe all of them, I'm not so sure about Bernie Ebbers, the chairman, were not a bunch of criminals and evil people who infiltrated WorldCom to perpetrate a fraud. They were perfectly ordinary people who got in a situation where they made the wrong choices. For instance, one quarter, their revenue numbers were not meeting the growth rate that was promised. The CFO said, "I've been looking at the numbers along the way. I've seen a lot of activity. I think there's something wrong with the numbers. But we've got to report to the analysts in an hour. Let's just take some money out of this reserve fund, put it into revenue, so we'll hit our number for today, won't hurt the stock price, and then we'll figure out what was wrong with the numbers, put it back in the reserve fund, and it'll work out." And people thought, well, it seems reasonable, no big deal. Just move the numbers for one day. And then, of course, the next month it's off again. They take a little more out. Next month it's off again, a little more out. Then they start doing other things. Where it gets to the point where it's a multi-billion-dollar fraud with lots of people who have done something wrong. See, it was a small thing, but now they know it was wrong. So they do a bigger wrong thing. As she was collecting evidence, she finally went to a controller and laid out her evidence and said, "How can you explain this?" And he told her everything. He said he had made a promise to himself once he went down this path that he knew he didn't have the strength to be the whistleblower. But if anyone asked him point blank what was going on, he was going to tell the truth. So he told her and went home and killed himself. Because he couldn't live with, who he'd become. So it's these small things, taking the pill every day, saying, "No, I won't do that," to minor bookkeeping entries. that keeps people from having the whole thing not work, having thousands of people lose their investments in MCI WorldCom, having people land in hospitals. Drug compliance is a huge problem. There's a significant proportion of hospital stays that are because of people not taking or incorrectly taking their medication. But it's not being addressed as an integrity issue. As to be workable, you want to set things up in such a way that people can follow through on what they know they should do. What responses do we have to those stories?
I just have trouble relating it back to where you started, and you have to forgive me. I'm not used to thinking in grand, abstract terms lately, but it doesn't seem to me that this really addresses the issue of integrity. I think the example of the checklist is more germane because there's this thing about the integrity and the consequences isn't as connected. The girl goes into the office. It's her life that she's putting on the line. And I put that on my calculator, by the way. That was a really impressive thing. The .995 raised to 365 power is so different than .9995.
Yeah, I had to run the numbers too. I couldn't believe it.
I couldn't believe it. That's really amazing, but it's true. Okay. So anyway, but my point is that she is making a choice that she may not be well informed about. Like she probably never did that calculation, or wasn't aware of that calculation or the implications. That's one thing. That's different from the doctors in Michigan knowing. They're saying, I will not be bothered with this goddamn checklist, and I don't care. They're not saying that out loud because they can't say that. They'll say instead, it slows us down too much, it does this too much, it does that too much. And yet what they were doing was so successful that it was worthy of a book. You know, it's just a different level of problem. Strikes me anyway.
Yeah, I think what unites them is to be reminded of the importance of setting up structures that improve the chances of integrity. Having checklists, explaining to patients what the odds really are over time, getting people out of their day-to-day expedience and opportunism to look at things over a longer time horizon where they can make better decisions. So when it stops being a moral issue or an ethical issue where you're a good person or a bad person, and it's a workability issue, then we can approach it as well. What kind of education, what kind of charts, what kind of paperwork can we use to support people? They're not bad. They just need a better format to get it to do the right thing.
Okay, so but again, this is the context, and you've introduced this subject with Earhart and Jensen. Is that his name? Jensen?
Yes.
Jensen's paper. So they're saying the girl who didn't take her drug, and to speak to your wanting to have a structure, she should see that on the blackboard when she first agrees to take the pill. Like, here are the reasons you take the pill. You do that little calculation. Will you take the pill? And she says, I will take the pill, and you try to create that structure. The doctors in Michigan, they already have that structure. They're supposed to be helping the patients. They've taken an oath to do so.
Yeah, when you say supposed to be, you're getting into an ethical or a moral position.
I'm saying it's like your friend who...
I'm sorry I used that word. They took an oath that they will help patients. They have made a statement, I will help people get better. They have seen evidence that says doing this helps people get better, and then they said, I won't do it.
Well, this checklist came from a doctor in Maryland who spent a lot of time on his own driving around the country, giving presentations, explaining it to various doctors and institutions. And I see it similar to that example you gave of your friend who had the right solution, but the team didn't pick her way of doing it. We can say there's something wrong with the doctors, they're not keeping their oaths, and get moralistic about it, and probably get nowhere. Or we can take the attitude of the doctor who invented it, saying, well, I just haven't communicated it well enough. I haven't convinced enough people. I haven't found a way to build it into their routine so they will do what works. Because once you start accusing people of being wrong, they don't listen anymore.
All right, so this is why I never get anything done.
What do you mean?
Well, because it's very easy for me to get moralistic here. I'm indignant at these guys throughout this process. It just seems it's absurd on its face. And it makes me have even less, confidence in another institution, which is medicine.
Yeah, so you get to be right, but it doesn't make you any healthier.
Right. So you just, yeah. So, okay, so now we've done the first piece of coaching.
Yeah, it's a key for management is to approach people in a way, how can I help them do the right thing? And I'm using the morally freighted language too. How can I help them do the thing that gets them where we all agree we want to go? And sometimes it's simple stuff. There's a professor at Cornell, I think he's in the hospitality school, did some research with people who work in hotels, the people who make the beds, clean the hallways, that sort of thing. And there were measurements in place of the effectiveness of these teams. Apparently they clean in teams. So they had measurements already in the effectiveness of the teams. He polled the teams on how much they trusted their supervisor. Trust being, can you rely on your supervisor to do the things that he or she says she will do? There was a very strong correlation between the effectiveness of the teams and how much they trust their supervisor. When people feel like they're working for someone that they can't trust, they are not as effective. So just, for any manager, anyone who's trying to get something done with other people, which is everybody, acting consistent with your words is going to have people give you better performance. It's workable. Yet so often I hear managers making excuses for keeping people in the dark or shading the truth or actively misleading people because that'll be more effective. That'll make the business run. Oh, we can't tell them that. It'll mess things up. I haven't seen a good case where that's true. People are adults until they get to the office, it seems, and then we have to spoon feed things to them. No, let's be straight. Let's be honest. And so often I have clients come to me to talk about complex compensation plans and incentives and phantom stock and options. I say, have you asked them what they want? What will motivate them? I had a client a few years ago, had 2 engineers that were crucial to the business, had very high demand skills. They could get a job by the end of the day if they didn't want to work with him anymore. And he was thinking about giving them options, large bonuses. And I said, have you talked to them about what matters to them? He went to lunch. They were all excited about this. The iPod had recently come out. They were hard to get. Well, he went out, did some research, tracked down a couple of iPods, gave them to these engineers. They were his for life, for a few $100s. Because he listened to what matters to them. He got them involved in the process, instead of trying to sort of manipulate and design things in isolation. Another interesting thing from Professor Simon's research is he found that groups that had regarded each other as being high in competence, which is a whole other conversation, and high in integrity, were able to argue effectively, that they could vehemently disagree and still have good relationships, make decisions, and move forward. You think about it, it makes sense. Why would I bother having an active disagreement and discussion with someone that I don't trust to follow through on it anyway? So it turns out arguing is not necessarily a sign of a poorly functioning team. It could be a sign that you've got a strong team that can withstand that kind of disagreement. Well, I wouldn't be a coach if I didn't finish up with this question, which is, given these distinctions, do you see any opportunities in your own lives, something you might put in, stop doing, do differently out of this idea of integrity?
Well, integrity is a very interesting subject, and it's a very slippery subject. People talk about integrity like people will talk about having a car. A lot of people say, I have integrity. I'm a firm believer that we do not have integrity, like we have a car, or we have a shirt, or we have a hat. I think integrity is something that you always have to be working on it. I compare integrity with laundry, okay? So you've been traveling and you keep, putting your dirty clothes in a basket, and now it's Saturday morning and you say, God, I gotta do laundry. So you go around, take all the stuff you have, you take it downstairs, you put them in the washer, you dry it up, you fold it, you put them in the drawers, and now you say, wow, I got everything I own is clean. And that night, you're going to take your clothes off, you're going to take your underwear, you're going to take your socks, you're going to take your t-shirt, and now you have laundry. So the laundry done, it lasted you only a few hours. Well, integrity is the same. You cannot have integrity like I have a hat. I can leave my hat on top of the chair, get up tomorrow morning, the hat is there. That's not the way it's with integrity. Every single interaction I have in the world, I must ensure that has integrity. Every single interaction, every conversation, every email, every text, everything I do, I need to know that this has integrity.
Well, how do you keep that in your awareness? How do you maintain that as a continual?
You have to create a practice. The same way you learn how to meditate, and meditating can become a practice for you, something that you don't do, something you don't do before you go to bed at night. If you have good oral hygiene, you're going to floss, you're going to water pick, and you're going to brush your teeth every night, and maybe several times a day. How do you get to that practice? By being present. Human beings are not present to what's going on. So you have to you need to stand on your feet and be present to what's going on. Because when I have to do something, like you say, if I had to follow a procedure in a hospital, if I had to follow a procedure inspecting an aircraft, if I had to inspect a pharmaceutical product that's going to go through the line, if I don't operate with integrity, somebody's going to be killed. So it has taken me 20 years to get where I am. But I cannot tell you I have integrity like I have a hat, or I have a pair of shoes, or I have a laptop. I have to work on my laptop every morning. I get up, turn it on, the thing goes on.
Right. But integrity is more like your breath. You don't have breath. You just have to keep breathing. And when you stop, it's a problem.
But we are unaware of breathing. Most people do not breathe. We are not aware, and we are lousy breathers. You get into meditating, you get into yoga, you're going to learn really how to breathe. You don't have to breathe 20 times a minute. You can breathe 6 times a minute and be more healthy. But you have to put effort to do that. So integrity takes a lot of effort. And I would not dare ever to say, Tony, you have no integrity, man. Because you never have integrity. Now, I can say to you, Tony, this transaction that we're doing here, this deal you want to cut with me, appears to me that doesn't have integrity. Can you see the difference? This deal that we're going to do, this contract we're going to sign, it appears to me that has no integrity. So it's the contract that's lacking integrity. Now, if you wrote the contract, well, you bringing forward your lack of integrity the way you write contracts. Maybe they're only one way. It's 100% for you and 0 for me.
Rohit, any actions or practices you see putting in out of the conversation?
Well, one practice to do is to be present to everything I do. Listen, many years ago, I learned to keep track of every promise I make, as little as it can be. If I talk to my grandson, Marcos, and I say to him, honey, I saw these, I'm going to get you one of those, I go into my phone and I have a file for Marcus. It's called Promises to Marcus. And I write down that I promised to buy a new seat for his bicycle. If I promise to Robin, my partner, I'm going to do something for her. Hey, now I don't need to write down. I need to take the garbage every Thursday morning. It's a practice for me. We moved in this house 2.5 years, so now I don't have to write it down. But at the beginning, I needed to put a little sticker somewhere. Take the garbage out before you go to work.
Right. You have to create that practice.
When the practice got created, then it has integrity for me. I have never, in 2.5 years, not put the garbage before the garbage man got over here.
And I think that's part of the value that comes from taking out the moral freighting of this. It takes time to build up the practice, to have the habit. Things go wrong. You have to get back on.
That would be one practice, is to be aware of what you say, what you do, what you write, and so forth and so on. And then sometimes willing. I ask salespeople, are you willing to lie to the customer in order to get a $50,000 sale? And you'll be surprised the numbers. They will say yes. It's in the 90th percentile. People will say yes.
Well, those are the ones who are aware of it.
Yeah.
It's so ingrained. I trained salespeople too, and I remember once I set them up on a role play, and the role play was have your partner ask you a question about your product or service that you hate to get. It's a place where you know you're weak. And then as they worked on this, I walked around the room and listened in. One person asked a client a question, and the client started talking about how they do that. I said, wait a minute, Monty. As far as I know, your company doesn't do that. He said, that's true, they don't. I said, why are you lying to him? He says, I don't know. But I think it's because there's just this tremendous urge to please, to say what you think they want to hear. But you have to be aware of the fact that doesn't work.
But they have a big incentive to make the sale.
I think.
But he wasn't a role play. He wasn't even making the sale. He was just trying to please.
Yeah. I think in the book Good to Great, the author talks about many, many years ago. This is about probably 40 years ago, okay? Because it's way, way back in technology. Motorola had this big deal. One of the salespeople had this big deal with a country in South America. They have something like $150 million deal. Today it's not that much money, but at that time it was a huge amount of money. And then they go to the executive board, okay, to approve this transaction. And the guy tells them, I said, look, this deal is $150 million. They're requesting that we have to build them for $155 million. 150 millions go for what we're going to produce, and the other 5 millions need to be given to this general. The chairman of the board of Motorola says, you know something? We are not doing this deal, and we will never work with this country until that general no longer has anything to do with the government of the country. And said no to a $150 million deal. Now imagine if you were the salesman. How do you feel about it? But this is what I'm saying. Today in business is not about integrity. It's about the money. It's about the money. And that's why we're in the hole that we are. Don't tell me somebody didn't know about Mayo-The. Well, Mayo-The said the other day in an interview, somebody in the New York Times interviewed him the other day and was on the news, and the guy said, listen, all the banks knew. You got to be stupid not to know what I was doing. But nobody ever wrinkled the nose. Why? Because everybody was making money out of my deals. You see, the people that were on this scheme, they knew, because you cannot get paid what you are getting paid for money. They took the money, but one day I ran out of money.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Julio. Rohit, anything you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's for me anyway, the person or the relationship in which I have the least integrity is probably with myself in these terms.
Yeah.
And and I love the distinction, and that's where I'm going to try to keep this. And the moral loading and freighting of things is, first of all, if I'm angry at something, it's a great trigger that I'm not doing anything useful. And secondly, and more concretely for me, is just, like, for example, today, I had the time to, and I just didn't write a piece that I wanted to write. A little description of a strategy I do, and then it leaves me feeling like shit. And and just treat these deals that I make with myself about, treat my own checklist like a deal that's an integrity.
Right. That's a big thing. And one thing people often ask me about organizing themselves and their to-do lists and getting things done. One of the most important things we can do is to look at the list and say there are certain things we are not going to do. We wanted to do it. We told ourselves we were going to do it. You know what? I'm not going to do it. And just getting back into integrity by reneging and accepting the consequences of that frees up a huge amount of energy that you can apply to the things you are going to do.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff lying out there that I'm never going to do that still sits in my inbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a natural thing to fall into. Just like that sales guy in the role play. Well, you want to say yes. You'd like to think that's going to happen. But hey, it takes a toll. It erodes workability. Yeah, it's not a moral thing. Everybody does it. It's permissible. It's just not effective. So if you look at it in terms of effectiveness and workability, I think it's easier to make those choices and set up new practices. Well, I enjoyed having the two of you with me. I hope I'll hear you at future teleseminars and tell people to join us. We can have a conversation on other pertinent topics.
Cool. Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. It was very nice meeting you, Julio.
Thank you very much, Tony. I appreciate that. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. More information is available at tonymayo.com. We appreciate your comments, suggestions for future topics, and, most of all, stories of how you applied the coaching. Our email address is podcast@mayogenuine.com. This podcast is the property of top executive coach Tony Mayo, copyright 2011.